The hospital lobby smelled like disinfectant and coffee that had been sitting too long on a warming plate. White walls, bright lights, everything designed to feel clean and distant. Ruth Jackson stood just inside the revolving doors, hands wrapped tightly around the strap of a faded canvas bag. She was a black woman in her late 40s, wearing a worn grey jacket over her work uniform. The name of the private cleaning company was stitched above her chest, the letters slightly frayed from years of washing. She wasn't there for treatment. She wasn't there to work. She was there because her sister had collapsed at home that morning, and the ambulance had brought her here, to the only hospital within miles that claimed to accept everyone. Ruth walked toward the front desk. Behind it sat a young white receptionist, typing quickly, barely glancing up as Ruth approached. "Excuse me," Ruth said softly. "My sister, Denise Jackson, was brought in earlier. I just need to see her." The receptionist finally looked up. Her eyes flicked down first, to the jacket, to the shoes, to the bag, then back to Ruth's face. "Do you have insurance?" she asked. I'm not the patient," Ruth replied. "I just want to check on her." The receptionist sighed, already tired of the conversation she assumed this would be. "Visitors need to wait until a nurse contacts them," she said, "and visiting hours are limited." Ruth nodded. "I understand, but no one has called me, and I don't know if—" "Mum," the receptionist interrupted, lowering her voice. "The emergency department is very busy. You can wait outside." Outside. Ruth glanced around the lobby. White families sat comfortably in chairs. Some spoke quietly, others laughed softly, as if illness were an inconvenience rather than a threat. No one else was being asked to leave. "I can wait right here," Ruth said calmly. "I won't be in the way." The receptionist's smile tightened. "We need to keep the lobby clear," she said. "This isn't a place for loitering." Loitering. The word landed heavy in Ruth's chest. "I clean hospitals," Ruth said before she could stop herself. "I know how they work." That only made things worse. The receptionist leaned back slightly, crossed her arms. "Security," she said into the phone beside her. "I need assistance at the front desk." Ruth stood still. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She watched as a white security guard approached, hand resting casually near his belt. "Is there a problem?" he asked the receptionist. "She's refusing to leave," the receptionist replied. The guard turned to Ruth. "Ma'am, you'll need to step outside," he said. "If the staff needs you, they'll contact you." Ruth wanted to explain that she had worked double shifts for years, that she had cleaned operating rooms at night while doctors slept, that she paid taxes that helped fund this building. Instead, she nodded. "I'll wait," she said quietly. Outside. The automatic doors slid shut behind her with a soft, final sound. Ruth sat on a concrete bench near the ambulance bay, the cold seeping through her clothes. Sirens came and went. Stretchers rolled past. No one looked at her. Hours passed. No call came. When Ruth finally went home that night, exhausted and hollow, she sat at her small kitchen table and stared at her hands. Hands that had scrubbed floors spotless. Hands that had been invisible in rooms where lives were saved. She thought about the way the receptionist had looked at her. Not with cruelty, with certainty, certain that Ruth didn't belong inside those walls. Ruth didn't cry. She stood up, walked to the bedroom, and pulled a metal box from the back of her closet. Inside were bank statements, careful records, and documents she had never shown anyone. Years of saving, years of living small, years of planning quietly. Ruth Jackson had cleaned hospitals her entire life. What no one inside that building knew, what they would one day be forced to confront, was that the woman they had turned away at the door was not poor. She was patient, and one day she would return to that same hospital not asking for answers, but deciding what it deserved to receive. Ruth Jackson returned to work the next morning like nothing had happened. The alarm rang at 4:30. She dressed in the dark so she wouldn't wake her neighbor's children through the thin apartment walls. coffee brewed weak and bitter. Her cleaning uniform hung where it always did, pressed carefully, ready. At the hospital where she worked, not the one that had turned her away, no one asked about her sister. No one noticed the heaviness in her eyes. Ruth pushed her cart through hallways that smelled of antiseptic and sleep deprivation, wiping down surfaces that would be dirty again before the hour ended. She had learned long ago that grief didn't earn time off. As she cleaned an empty operating room, Ruth's mind returned again and again to the automatic doors closing behind her. Not the sound, the ease of it. How simple it had been for them to decide she didn't belong. She had spent her entire adult life being easy to remove. Invisible uniforms, night shifts, back hallways. Ruth wasn't uneducated. She wasn't careless. She was careful in a way only people without safety nets learned to be. Every paycheck had always been divided the same way: rent, utilities, food, and savings, even when the savings line felt cruelly optimistic. When her co-workers spent breaks complaining about money, Ruth stayed quiet. They didn't know she invested, not in anything flashy, no shortcuts, just slow, steady contributions to mutual funds her credit union advisor had once explained to her patiently, without judgment. Ruth asked questions. She took notes. She listened. Years passed like that. Then more. Her sister Denise had been the only one who knew. "You live like you're broke," Denise used to say. "But you're not." Ruth would smile. "I live like I remember." Remembered eviction notices taped to doors. Remembered payday loans. Remembered what panic felt like when your body broke before your bank account could help. Denise had collapsed from untreated hypertension, the kind that grows quietly when checkups are delayed and care is rationed. The hospital eventually called Ruth 2 days later. Her sister was stable, but the delay had cost her kidney function. Earlier intervention would have helped, the doctor said gently. Ruth nodded. She didn't blame him, but she didn't forget the system. That night, Ruth opened the metal box again. She laid the documents out neatly across the table: investment statements, retirement accounts, a trust she had set up without telling anyone, not even Denise. The numbers startled people when they saw them. They never startled Ruth. They represented time, sacrifice, and restraint. She opened her laptop and searched for the hospital's name, the one that had turned her away. Annual reports, endowment figures, capital campaigns. She read quietly, methodically. She learned which donors were celebrated and which ones had conditions attached. She learned how often the hospital spoke about community and how rarely that word included people like her unless they were being photographed. Ruth closed the laptop and sat back. She didn't feel anger. She felt resolve. She had cleaned hospitals long enough to understand how power worked inside them, not in exam rooms, in boardrooms, not through care, through funding, and Ruth Jackson had something the hospital didn't expect from someone who scrubbed their floors for a living. She had leverage. The woman they asked to wait outside had been building something quietly for decades, and the next time she walked through those doors, it wouldn't be as a visitor. It would be as someone whose presence could not be dismissed, not politely, not easily, not without consequence. Because patience, Ruth had learned, wasn't passive. It was preparation. Ruth Jackson didn't announce herself. She never had. The first call she made wasn't to the hospital. It was to a non-profit legal clinic she had once cleaned late at night, empty offices echoing as she pushed her mop past framed mission statements. Back then, a junior lawyer had spoken to her kindly, explaining things Ruth hadn't known how to ask about yet. The lawyer remembered her. More importantly, she listened. Within weeks, Ruth's finances were reviewed quietly. Trust structures clarified, assets protected. Everything Ruth had built alone was now reinforced with language institutions respected. Next came conversations, not demands, not accusations, questions. Ruth attended a community health forum hosted by the very hospital that had turned her away. She sat in the back row, anonymous, taking notes while executives spoke about outreach, equity, and future expansion. Slides flashed statistics. Applause followed. When the floor opened for questions, Ruth stood. She didn't raise her voice. "Can you explain," she asked calmly, "why visitor access protocols differ based on perceived ability to pay?" The room stilled. A panelist offered a rehearsed answer about safety and efficiency. Ruth nodded, thanked them, and sat back down. She wasn't there to win. She was there to map resistance. Over the next year, Ruth made 2 donations. Small ones, targeted. One funded blood pressure screenings in neighborhoods like hers. Another supported patient advocates, people whose job was to stand with families who didn't know how to navigate hospital language. The hospital thanked her by email. No ceremony, no plaque. They didn't know who she was. That changed when Ruth's attorney requested a meeting, not with administration, with the board. The request included a proposed gift amount. The number made people sit up straighter. On the day of the meeting, Ruth wore a simple navy suit. No jewelry beyond a watch she had bought years ago on sale. Her hair was pulled back neatly. Nothing about her looked extravagant. Everything about her looked prepared. The boardroom was cool, all glass and polished wood. Men and women in tailored suits shook her hand, smiling politely, already forming assumptions that didn't fit. They spoke first, about gratitude, about vision, about how meaningful her interest was. Ruth listened. Then she spoke. "I'm here because I believe hospitals should treat access as care," she said evenly, "not as a privilege." One board member nodded slowly. Another leaned forward. Ruth described the morning her sister collapsed, the hours waiting outside, the word loitering, no names, no drama, just facts. The room shifted. She slid a single document across the table, a proposal, a major donation, conditional, funds earmarked for patient navigation, equitable intake training, and revised security protocols. And, Ruth added, "I'd like to be involved." Silence followed. Not rejection. Calculation. This was the moment Ruth had imagined many times, not as confrontation, but as clarity. They couldn't undo what had happened, but they couldn't ignore her now. When the meeting ended, handshakes were firmer, smiles more careful. Outside, Ruth paused near the same revolving doors that had once turned her out. This time, they opened easily, and for the first time, Ruth understood that she had crossed an invisible line. Not into wealth, not into power for its own sake, but into a position where her presence required acknowledgement. The hospital had once decided she didn't belong inside. Now it was adjusting its future around her, and Ruth Jackson was just getting started. The announcement was made on a Monday morning. Not in the lobby, not in a press conference. In a board memo that circulated internally before the public ever heard about it. Ruth Jackson had been named the hospital's chief philanthropic donor for the new Community Access Initiative. Her name appeared in bold at the top of the document. No title attached, no backstory included, just the acknowledgement that the largest unrestricted gift in the hospital's history had come from someone who wanted no wing named after her and no portrait hung in her honour. Staff reactions rippled quietly. Some were confused, some were curious. A few, uncomfortably, began to remember. A receptionist reread the name twice. A security supervisor paused mid-email. Faces connected to a memory that hadn't felt important at the time. Ruth didn't attend the first press briefing. She was at work, her regular job, finishing out the final weeks of her cleaning contract. She wanted to leave properly, on her own terms. When she turned in her badge, her supervisor hugged her, stunned. "You never said anything," the woman whispered. Ruth smiled gently. "You never asked." The hospital changes came slowly, and then all at once. Visitor intake procedures were rewritten. Security staff received new training led by patient advocates, not consultants. A permanent office for family navigation was built near the emergency entrance, not hidden, not optional, and every employee, from surgeons to janitorial staff, attended the same session on access and bias. No exceptions. Ruth attended too. She sat in the back, listening as facilitators described scenarios she had lived through. No one recognized her at first. When they did, the room fell silent. Ruth stood. "I'm not here to punish anyone," she said calmly. "I'm here to make sure no one else has to stand outside wondering if their life matters enough to be let in." No one applauded. They nodded. Months later, Ruth walked through the hospital lobby again. The same white walls, the same smell of disinfectant and coffee, but this time a patient advocate approached her immediately. "Can I help you?" the woman asked warmly. Ruth smiled. "Yes," she said, "you already are." She visited her sister in a bright, accessible room. Denise's treatment was ongoing, but she was stable, supported, seen. As Ruth stood by the window, watching nurses move with quiet urgency, she felt no triumph, only relief. The receptionist who had once called security passed by, stopped, and froze. I'm sorry," she said, voice unsteady. Ruth met her eyes. "I believe you," she replied, and that was enough. Ruth Jackson never became famous. Her name appeared on annual reports and donor lists, but she didn't attend galas. She didn't give speeches. She didn't correct people when they assumed she came from money. She had come from work, from patience, from silence mistaken for weakness. The hospital that once turned her away would now teach her story, not as redemption, but as instruction. Because power doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it returns quietly, through the same doors that once refused to open.